Hello, my name is Lyle Burrup. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I work for LDS Family Services. I have since about September of 1979. I'm happy to be here today to talk a little bit with you about the treatment of anxiety. I've entitled my presentation, The ABCs of Anxiety. One of the things I've noticed about anxiety is generally anxiety is a normal, functional, appropriate emotion that all of us experience. Helps us protect ourselves, it motivates us to improve. And I've often wondered, why is it that anxiety gets out of control and turns into an anxiety disorder? You know, there's an interesting theory established by Yerkes and Dodson, two psychologists in the early 1900s. They established what they called the performance curve. This slide is a demonstration of kind of their concept. Basically what they said was that anxiety or pressure and stress can actually enhance training up to a certain point. And so that as stress goes up, then learning will also go up to an optimum level of performance. But if stress continues to go up out beyond that level, then performance will start to drop off. Most of you have seen that happen, I'm sure, with clients that you've worked with, people who are having a difficult time performing and functioning at a level that they normally could. What I want to do today is talk to you a little bit about some of the theories behind anxiety. Three of them are depicted on this slide. You're all familiar with the cognitive behavioral model for anxiety, and that is that basically anxiety is a result of how we think and act. There's the medical model. Anxiety is a result of some kind of disease or hormonal imbalance within the individual. And another model, maybe you haven't heard of, diathesis stress model. Diathesis basically means vulnerable, a vulnerability. And so you mix a vulnerability and stress together. Anxiety is a result of an inborn genetic vulnerability and too much stress. Diathesis and stress are complementary in this model. Neither is sufficient by itself to result in anxiety, but if you have a vulnerability and a high level of stress, and the vulnerability may be, and is usually biological, then it may be that you'll develop an anxiety disorder. Families tend to respond to stress in similar patterns. In my family, people under stress may develop a problem with depression. In my wife's family, they may tend to develop a problem with anxiety. And so we've noticed that stress and vulnerability mixed together often will result in some kind of an anxiety disorder or depression. A few years ago, I attended a seminar by David Burns. Most of you are familiar with David Burns. And I learned a lot of very helpful concepts that helped me understand these models and how these interact and work together and how to use these models in particular in treating people that I'm working with. So in putting this training together, I've determined that what we'd best focus on is helping you as a practitioner learn to understand, assess, and treat what I call the underlying causes of anxiety. By underlying causes of anxiety, I mean that there are personality traits, cognitive processes, behavioral patterns, and emotional factors that tend to mix and work together and result often in an anxiety disorder. This presentation will not address the biological or hormonal issues and medication. That would have to be saved, I guess, for another presentation. Let me show you another slide that will depict a little bit of what I mean by underlying causes. I draw this kind of like I guess I'd characterize anxiety as an iceberg. The tip of the iceberg represents the anxiety symptoms, differentiating symptoms unique to each disorder. Those of you who have worked with people with anxiety disorders are familiar with the characteristics of OCD versus panic attacks, panic disorder, and phobic disorders. And you've learned how to treat those, and it's important to treat those primary causes or primary issues and anxiety symptoms. But underlying that are the personality, cognitive, behavioral, and emotional things that come together that often tend to sustain the anxiety and the disorder. And unless those are effectively treated, then the individual will usually not recover. Most of the professional literature you have available to you addresses mainly the tip of the iceberg and how to work with panic disorders or how to work with OCD, how to work with phobias, how to do desensitization therapy. But very little of the literature addresses personality traits, cognitive processes, and behavioral patterns that fit together and how to work on that and how to treat those. And so in this presentation, by the time we get through, you'll have a much better understanding of that. You'll notice out on the side are the biochemical processes and stress listed to fit into all three of the models of the cognitive, the medical model, and the stress diathesis model. Basically, the first thing I think that's important is that you use a very reliable instrument to measure anxiety. There are three that you're familiar with, probably. David Burns has a very brief model for assessing depression, anxiety. It's a very accurate, reliable instrument. It's much briefer than the Beck Anxiety Inventory. And then you're also familiar with the outcome questionnaire. The outcome questionnaire in particular has 3 questions that may help you in tracking over time how your clients are doing with anxiety. Questions number 10, I feel fearful. Number 16, I am concerned about family troubles. And number 25, disturbing thoughts come into my mind that I cannot get rid of, may help you. But there are some other questions. Question 26, I feel a need to escape. 27, I have an upset stomach. Those are helpful. 29, my heart pounds too much, commonly a characteristic or symptom of anxiety. 33, I feel that something bad is going to happen. You can monitor the progress with that. 35, I feel afraid of open spaces, of driving, etc. 36, I feel nervous. 40, I feel something is wrong with my mind. And then 41, I have trouble falling asleep or staying asleep. Those are all symptomatic of anxiety, but they don't necessarily mean that a person has a problem with anxiety. But they may help you if you use the outcome questionnaire repetitively through your treatment to keep an eye on what's happening with the anxiety level with your clients. But I think it's important that you use an instrument initially and then you use that throughout your treatment to monitor progress. Let's talk first about the personality traits. One of the things that you've probably noticed is that most people who suffer from anxiety disorders are, quote, very nice people. They are people pleasers, they're peacemakers, they work very hard to make people happy and to keep peace around them. This niceness actually sometimes gets in the way and is part of what causes the hidden emotion, which we will talk about later when we talk about emotional causes for anxiety. One of the important things is that a person can learn to be a nice person without being anxious by learning to manage perfectionism, for example, cognitive beliefs and distortions, and then this hidden emotion issue that I've mentioned. So that's one of the things it's important to be aware of, and it's important to address in your treatment. I just lost there we go. Personality traits. Another personality trait is perfectionism. A lot of people have this sense that, quote, I must be perfect. My personal worth and people's love and respect depend on me being perfect and doing things well. And then if I don't, then my worth goes down and people won't like me. There's a really good instrument by David Burns, a perfectionism scale, that hopefully we can provide you a copy of that with this training that is very effective, and we'll look at that in a minute. one of the things I do is I use this perfectionism scale of David Burns, and then I also use a chapter out of one of his books entitled Feeling Good, The New Mood Therapy. Many of you probably have a copy of this. Chapter 14 in this book has a list of about 15 exercises that he recommends that you use with your clients. And I've used this material. I give my clients a copy of it, have them read those. I go through the exercises with them. Some of them we do together, some of them they do on their own. But those are very effective in helping and address the issue of perfectionism and learn how to manage this. If they will do all 15 exercises, they will almost certainly learn to manage their perfectionism. Unfortunately, too many people allow perfectionism to take over, and they are managed by their perfectionism. They're working for their perfectionism. Some of them become slaves to their perfectionism. And if people will do these exercises that David Burns recommends, they can turn that around so that perfectionism starts to become an asset and a tool and a help to them instead of a liability. So I found that it's important to address that issue. At the present time I work at the MTC, most of the missionaries I work with have a problem with perfectionism when they have a problem with anxiety. So let's look at this perfectionism scale. This is a scale that he put together. David Burns does a lot of testing with his scales until he finds that they are highly reliable and dependable. And this, I will administer this to a missionary. I'll give them a copy of this and then read through these questions. The instructions say, after each attitude, put a check in the column that represents how you think and feel most of the time. First statement, people will think less of me if I make a mistake, and then they will rate how much they agree or disagree with that. I feel less worthwhile when I fail. People would look down on me if they found out about all the mistakes I've made. 4, I usually get very upset if I make a mistake. And the word very is the operative word in this. So they get very upset rather than mildly upset. And then the last one, I feel like I should try to be perfect. Now, members of the church obviously believe that they should be perfect. So on that last one, I'll usually ask them if they apply that issue of being perfect to everything that they do. Then you can add up the scores. Low scores from 0 to 10 represent area of psychological strength. If they score somewhere between 11 and 20, what that means is that they're emotionally vulnerable to stress, and it would be a good thing for them to learn to work on that. Now, this instrument is I use this quite a bit in talking with missionaries, and I will talk to them about number 1 and number 3. Number 1, what people will think of them if they make a mistake, and number 3, if people look down on them for making mistakes, and we talk about that. And is it in reality a problem for them? Do the people in their lives think less of them every time they make a mistake, and do they look down? I ask them if they have friends. And if they have friends, I ask them if their friends think they're perfect. And usually they'll say no, their friends realize they're not perfect. And so then I'll say, okay, so explain to me the discrepancy here. People are going to look down on you, and yet you have friends. Is it possible you might be wrong about this? And so we spend some time talking about this. And I'll use this instrument to do some logical persuasion with a client and trying to help them see that maybe these beliefs are really not accurate and not true. The second one is helpful. I feel less worthwhile when I fail. What that would suggest is that my worth as a person goes up and down depending on my performance. If I do really well, then my worth goes up, and if I don't do so well the next day, my worth goes down. And so my worth goes up and down, and our society teaches us that, and it says in many ways that that's true. The students who get scholarships are the best students. The students who get scholarships to play sports are the best athletes. So our society has a tendency to reward the people who perform the best, the people who make the fewest mistakes in all kinds of ways. And So our society trains us to think this way and to buy into this notion that our worth is tied into our performance. Young missionaries have a difficult time with that concept. They come into the MTC feeling like they've got to do perfectly, and they start making mistakes. They're learning a language. You know, how many mistakes have you got to make to be fluent in a language? You got to make tens of thousands of mistakes. Some of these young people can't allow one mistake, and they're in trouble. One of the missionaries I worked with would not speak his language. He didn't want to SYL or speak your own language because he couldn't speak perfectly. Obviously, the only way you learn to speak is by practicing. So we talk about that and talk about how these concepts and attitudes are really counterproductive. A lot of times missionaries think that their perfectionism is very helpful to them, but they're going under. And so it's helpful to them to go through that discussion, I've found. And then we will use those exercises by Burns, and I'll try to help them through some logical persuasion, cognitive restructuring procedures to see this differently. Let's move on to the next one. Next slide. Another, in regard to cognitive processes, one of the things I think that's important to be aware of and to teach your clients is that anxiety always lies. Anxiety will take the truth, twist it so that it's not recognizable, and distort the truth and turn it into a lie. Second thing is, David Burns, Beck, Ellis, many of the cognitive behavioral therapists, some of the best in the country, consider anxiety and depression to both be a thought disorder in the sense that it's a disorder in how we think. We refer to them as emotional disorders, obviously, but they're an emotional disorder because there's a disorder in the thinking. And anxiety always results from negative thoughts. Negative thoughts are always distorted, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, and I'll show you what I mean by that as we go through the presentation. One other thing to keep in mind, and you're all familiar with this concept, when you change the way you think, you can change the way you feel. Most of you are familiar with that. David Burns says that the cure for anxiety is to learn to, quote, put the lie to your thoughts. If you can see that your thoughts are lying to you, then your thoughts can't distress you. If you believe your thoughts are accurate and true, which is usually what we believe, then they will disturb you. So clients need help learning how to do this and how to straighten this out. I've just thrown this slide in to help you remind you of what Ellis says, the ABCs of emotional disturbance. The events and experiences certainly set the stage for the feelings that we have, but our beliefs, attitudes, thoughts, and perceptions are really the key. Too many people will say that things like, "you make me mad," not recognizing that their feelings really are not a result of the event, but more of their thoughts and perceptions. Two people can have the same experience and feel completely different. And I'll talk about that with missionaries I'm working with, and they can recognize that and understand that concept. And most of them really do buy into the concept with a little bit of help, that beliefs and attitudes are something they can work on and change. And for many of them, it's a very freeing kind of feeling. They feel it's very helpful to them. They feel a lot of relief to realize they can now do something about this. And I explained that we are going to spend time showing them exactly what to do and how to do that. One other thing on cognitive beliefs. Beliefs are characteristic, the types of beliefs that are characteristic of anxiety in general can include cognitive distortions, self-defeating beliefs, and worry. And we'll talk just a little bit about each one of these in going through this. One of the things that most of you are aware of is that each of the emotional disorders, anxiety, panic disorder, phobic disorder have their own unique thoughts and distortions that are characterized in that disorder, and what are called dysfunctional schemas or patterns in how people think. And it's important that you understand, as you're treating somebody with OCD, that you understand those schemas. You understand the thought-action fusion process, for example, or the intolerance of uncertainty that people have, the heightened sense of responsibility they have for their thoughts and the need to fix those thoughts, the need to have complete control of thoughts, and that you understand those dynamics. What I want to do is talk a little bit about just the underlying cognitive processes that are characteristic of everybody with anxiety. This next slide, I think most of you are probably familiar with the cognitive distortions. Burns, Beck, many of the people who talk about cognitive distortions have identified these. And let's just kind of go through these together. The first one is all or nothing thinking. That's where people tend to look at themselves, life, and others in absolute black and white categories. Shades of gray do not exist. Overgeneralization, that's the tendency to perceive a negative trait or event as part of a never-ending pattern of defeat. Mental filter, that's the tendency to dwell on negative traits to the exclusion of other traits and qualities. Discounting the positives is a little bit different. You can see positives in your own traits, but you reject those and focus just on the negative. And then the fifth one, jumping to conclusions, that's a tendency to interpret things negatively. Now, Burns says there are two types of ways to jump to conclusions. The first one is fortune telling. That's where you predict things will turn out badly before they've even taken place. And then another one, mind reading. Without checking it out, you assume that other people are thinking negatively about you and that they have the same negative thoughts you're having with yourself. Another one, magnification and minimization. That's the tendency to exaggerate weaknesses and shortcomings and then minimize desirable qualities and accomplishments. Emotional reasoning, probably one of the most damaging. That's where people reason from how they feel. Something happens, we feel dumb, and so we then say to ourselves, I'm a dumb person. So the emotion becomes part of the person's identity. Should statements, and most of you know about should statements. You've heard the phrase tyranny of the should. Let me just make a couple of comments on should statements. When we use the word should comes from the same Greek word that the word scold comes from. Most of us, when somebody scolds us, we feel poorly. We feel offended. We have our feelings hurt. And often we feel the same way when we're using should statements. To use should in a thought about yourself or someone else suggests that, first of all, there is a law or rule involved, and second of all, there's a way to measure this, and third, you're not measuring up or I'm not measuring up. One of the things I hear often from missionaries is, I should be more worthy. And so I'll talk to the missionary and we'll talk about the importance of worthiness. But the confusion is that they don't know when they've arrived. You know, how worthy do you have to be a missionary? We've talked about the fact they've gone through interviews with their bishop and stake president. They've qualified, so to speak. They've been to the branch president and district president. They still can't seem to get a sense of worthiness themselves. Often they're struggling with OCD if they're having that kind of problem. And so in spite of what their priesthood leaders say, they feel like they should be more worthy. So that suggests that they're breaking this rule about how worthy you're supposed to be when there is really no objective way to measure that, except for maybe through behaviors, you know, praying, keeping your life morally clean, you're not smoking or drinking. And we do have some standards that help us determine worthiness. The Temple Recommend interview is an excellent way to determine worthiness. But the missionary or the individual will often lose sight of that and focus on other things. The only time that we can effectively use the word should and be on safe ground is when there is a rule and we can measure it. For example, I'll discuss this with the missionary and I'll ask them, should you pay your tithing? And they say yes. And I'll say, is there a rule about that? And they understand, yes, there's a commandment. Do you know whether you paid your tithing or not? Do you know how to measure that? Well, there are several ways to help you with that. Tithing settlement, you know how much money you've made. There's a way to measure that. Another question, should you, for example, drive the speed limit? And there's a way to measure that, and there's a way to know whether you're driving the speed limit. And so that doesn't seem to be such a self-condemning statement. Another type of law is our physical laws. Should you jump off of tall buildings? Well, obviously the answer is no, because of what's going to happen. And it's easy to measure what happens when we do those kinds of things. So if there is a physical, a legal, or a spiritual law, then we should comply with that. But we also need to have a way to measure that. There are a lot of spiritual laws that are difficult to measure. Certainly, the Ten Commandments have some very specific ways to measure that. And we know that we should not steal, but the issue of honesty, how honest do you have to be to ultimately be a completely honest person that you don't have to worry about that anymore? There's no way to measure that. And so a better way to talk about these issues is to say something like, I'd like to be more spiritual. I'd like to be more honest than I am right now. That then gives you at least some credit for wherever you are in your honesty or in your spirituality. And it doesn't condemn you for not being at a certain mark that is kind of subjective and is nebulous and nobody knows what it is anyway. So if there is no way to measure it, it's better to say, I'd like to be more spiritual. It'd be nice if I could be more spiritual. The ninth distortion is extreme overgeneralization. It's a tendency to overgeneralize, but to then start using labels. If you remember, overgeneralizing is focusing on a negative trait or event. Labeling is then taking that negative flaw or shortcoming and labeling yourself. Mislabeling is going even more extreme, using emotionally loaded terms and phrases to describe yourself or other people. And then the last one, self-blame and other blame. Now, many of these are interrelated, and I will teach these concepts to missionaries. I'll have them practice watch for them. We'll even go through examples. I will give them a list with some examples, and we will talk about that. And then I'll have them practice starting to watch for that in their conversations and things that other people say or in things that they think when they are distressed. The idea being to help them learn to recognize these, because then we want to start teaching them how to change that. And we'll talk about how to do that here in a few minutes. The next concept in regard to cognitive processes that lead to anxiety is self-defeating beliefs. David Burns has identified 15 different kinds of self-defeating beliefs. I've just listed a few on this slide. And for achievement, there's perfectionism, and we've talked a little bit about that. For love, there's approval addiction. Submissiveness, I must please other people and should always try to please them, even if I make myself miserable in the process. Depression, worthlessness and inferiority, often the belief is characterized by, I'm basically worthless, defective, and inferior to other people. For anxiety, one of them is, for example, the spotlight fallacy. Talking to people feels like having to perform under a spotlight. If I don't impress people by being sophisticated, witty, or interesting, they won't like me. Some others include, let's see, actually, let me back up just a minute to this list. in this book, this is another one of Burns's book. He talks about these different kinds of self-defeating beliefs, and he's got some ideas about how to work with this. A lot of exercises. The Feeling Good Handbook, a lot of you have this. A lot of you have read it and you have used it with your clients. That is just an excellent book, mainly because it's got so many exercises in it. What David Burns says is that self-defeating beliefs, it's important to learn to recognize those and to do some exercises with clients so you can identify what their self-defeating beliefs are. And he categorizes self-defeating beliefs into 3 categories. He says there are individual self-defeating beliefs that trigger depression and often result in self-esteem problems. There are interpersonal self-defeating beliefs that trigger anxiety and conflict and often result in conflict in relationships. And then there are techniques that will help you identify those. And that's where we want to go next, is let's just talk for a few minutes about a couple of techniques that are very effective in identifying self-defeating beliefs. One of them is called, the one I like the most and use most frequently, is the downward arrow technique. This is a process where the client may identify some event that is troubling them. And what I will do is I will hand the client a notebook, and I take one, and then we start writing down the answer to this question. And I will say, okay, let's say that that situation or event is true. Why would that be upsetting to you? What would it mean to you? And they will respond. And we will write down what they respond. And then I'll ask the same question again. If this were true, why would it be upsetting to you? What would it mean to you? And then basically the therapist continues to repeat this. And we continue to write down what the client says. It's kind of a way of peeling back anxiety one layer at a time, much like an onion. And by the time you get to 4, 5, 6 responses, you're starting to get into some pretty heavy-duty stuff that the client is troubled by. Let me just show you, for example, one that I did with a missionary recently. I was working with a sister who's quite perfectionistic, quite distressed, having a difficult time, highly talented, high achieving, comes from a superb family, musically talented. She tried out to sing, I think, at one of the devotionals, and in order to perform at the MTC, you have to pass a kind of an audition with the mission president's wife, and that makes those missionaries a little nervous to do that. And so we got together and I talked to her, and she said to me, my audition did not go well. I did not hit one of the notes very well. So we started doing this exercise, and I handed her the notepad, and she wrote that down. I wrote it down, and I said, okay, why was not hitting one of those notes very upsetting to you? She said to me, people would think I'm not a good singer. And I said, okay, let's assume that's true, that people think you're not a good singer. What would that mean to you? Why would that be upsetting to you? Her response was, that's my biggest talent. I wouldn't be worth much if I'm not a good singer. And I said, okay, let's say that you're not a good singer, that talent isn't as good as you thought it was, and you're not worth much. Why would that be upsetting to you? And she said, I'm not living up to what I can do. I said, so let's say that's true. You're not living up to what you can do. Why would that distress you? She said, I'm a total slacker. I said, so let's assume you're a total slacker. What would that mean to you? She said, my parents will get mad at me. I said, okay, let's assume your parents get mad at you, that you're a total slacker and they're upset. What would that mean to you? Why would that distress you? She said, that means I'm letting them down. And once again, I asked the same question. Her response was, I will feel bad about myself. And I said, so let's say you're feeling bad about yourself. What does that mean? And she came back to that issue. Again, I will be letting my parents down. Basically what I learned, and I think what she learned, but already kind of had a sense of, is that in this family, achievement means success. If you're not achieving, you're not successful. This missionary had a very strong negative feeling towards her parents around this issue. They weren't emotionally demonstrative. They often pressured her to achieve. She was frustrated that everything was about whether or not she was measuring up or not and letting her parents down, and she was kind of tired of that. So we spent some time talking about that. And I want to come back to that and talk about it as a hidden emotion as we get further into our presentation here. But that gives you something to talk about. There's a lot of information here. The other thing about this exercise, and the reason I like to have it written down, is because you look at all those statements of hers, and if you look at the cognitive distortions, any one of those, I'm a total slacker, for example. Does that sound like a little bit of all or nothing thinking? Does that sound like she's overgeneralizing? Does it sound like mental filter, that she's dwelling on a negative trait? Does it sound like she's discounting the positives? Is she jumping to conclusions? Is she magnifying and minimizing by saying I'm a total slacker? Does that sound like emotional reasoning? Does it sound like kind of an unstated should statement? I should be doing better and I'm not, so I'm a total slacker. Certainly there's a label there and there's some blame. And so she's got all 10 distortions in that simple statement. You know, how damaging is that statement right there? Obviously it's extremely damaging to her. And this is the way she talks to herself. And one of the things I will do is talk to them, and I'll identify some of these statements, and I'll say, do you say those things to your friends? Is this the way you talk to other people? And often they'll laugh, and they'll say no, and I'll ask them why they don't talk to other people that way, and they'll say, well, people would be offended. And I said, you talk that way to yourself, and you're not offended? And yet other people would be offended. You ought to be offended, considering the way you talk to yourself. They can often see the humor in that and realize that. And then we get into a discussion about the double standard of this. You know, they treat themselves so much more poorly than they do their friends. If they talk to their friends the way they talk to themselves, they wouldn't have any friends. And they start to realize that. And so it gives us an opportunity to talk about distortions, to talk about this double standard of how they treat themselves, to talk about the perfectionism, and then also to start doing some cognitive restructuring around that. So I keep those lists, and I will go back to those and use those. And there is probably 3 or 4 sessions worth of discussion just in that simple exercise. It's just a great exercise. I just love that. Let me show you 2 others that are very similar. This next slide has to do with the what-if technique. In this one, the client identifies some event that they fear. And so as a therapist, you say to the client, let's assume that happened. What are you the most afraid of? What's the worst that could happen? Well, they will respond, and you write that down, and then you say, okay, let's assume that happened. What are you the most afraid of? What's the worst that could happen? And so then you keep repeating this, and they keep responding, and you just get, again, a list of things that they believe. This will also help, this exercise, the what-if technique, will help identify what's called the hidden emotion, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes. So try this exercise. Give them a notepad. Give your clients a notepad. Have them identify some event they're fearful of, or when they identify something they're afraid of, pull out a notepad and go through this exercise with them and just keep asking this question. You may get a list of 10, 15 statements, and usually it'll take that many statements to get to the bottom line. But if you'll do this, this will be really powerful and very helpful to you in identifying the self-defeating beliefs that the client has, as well as hidden emotional issues. The third one for helping with this is called the interpersonal downward arrow, very much like the downward arrow exercise. The client identifies a negative belief or fear about some relationship they have. And the therapist can ask, depending on what they've said, if this were true, what would it tell you about your role in a loving relationship, or the other person's role, or the nature of a loving relationship? They will respond, and you write down their response, and then you will ask them the same question. And just keep repeating this until you get to, again, the bottom line in regard to what's going on with their beliefs. let me just show you one more slide. Helping the client resolve self-defeating beliefs. Once you've gone through any one of these 3 exercises, or maybe all 3 of them with a client, you want to then go beyond that and help them work this out. This is a good process described again by David Burns in chapter 7 of this book, the Feeling Good Handbook. What he says is, first, you help the client identify their self-defeating belief. You do one of these 3 exercises that we've just talked about. The second step is to do what he calls a cost-benefit analysis. In other words, you take a piece of paper, they take the paper, you write down, you draw a line down the middle, and list on the left-hand side the advantages and on the right-hand side the disadvantages of this particular belief that they have that you've identified. And they will list the benefits and the costs. And then the next point is to help them determine if the costs outweigh the benefits. The way I do that is I will ask them, if they put these on the scale, the benefits and the advantages, which weighs most, the advantages or the disadvantages? And usually they will say the disadvantages weigh more than the advantages. I'm losing more than I'm gaining from this. If it's the other way around, you're going to have resistance to change. If they're gaining more than they're losing, they don't want to change. But if they're losing more than they gain, they will want to change. And usually I ask them if they split it, 50, is it 50-50, 60-40, 70-30? That gives me a feel for, especially those benefits, how much those benefits weigh for them and mean to them. Because if it's 60-40, then they may be taking a risk by trying to give up the self-defeating belief and lose out on the benefits that that belief provides them. So it's important to spend time discussing that with them and kind of working that through and resolving that. One of the ways I do that is to identify that even though their belief is not probably true. For example, I must be perfect. I'll ask them, you aren't perfect, but yet you say these are the benefits. Is perfectionism delivering these things, or are you just achieving these things in spite of your perfectionism? And usually they can see that they're doing these things in spite of their perfectionism. Things like, it protects me from losing my friends, protects me from rejection, helps me to work hard, helps me to achieve a lot of things. And usually we will discuss whether or not they really have to give up those benefits by giving up the need or the belief that they've got to be perfect. Because I think it's important for them to see they may be able to hang on to the benefits, get rid of the disadvantages and the things that it's costing them, and still give up the belief. So that exercise is helpful. The third step then is to help them revise the belief so that they can maintain the advantages and get rid of the disadvantages, which is what I just kind of described. This will not cause change at the gut level, but it will point them in the right direction. To accomplish change, you have to get them to go one more step, and that is they've got to test their belief by them performing some kind of experimental technique. One missionary I was working with at the MTC came in, and one of the things that distressed him, he had a lot of anxiety, discomfort in relationships with people because he felt like if he ever imposed on people, they would be offended. And it even came down to things like asking somebody for something. And so we went through this process. We talked about it. We revised the belief. We discussed that. And I had him go out in his district and just try and experiment. And we talked about different options, and he chose one. And the one he chose was he was going to go ask each missionary in his district which scripture was their favorite scripture and why. And then after asking them that, he was going to ask them if they were offended by him asking this. Because in his mind, they would be offended. They didn't want to be troubled. He's just troubling people when he asks them questions. And what he found out was not only were they willing to share this with him, but they weren't offended, which really surprised him. So somehow you get your clients to try some kind of experiment, try out the new behavior. And number 3, what you're doing, well, part of what you want to do is help them come up with a more accurate script about themselves. And I will hand them a notepad, once again, on this belief. And we will start restructuring a more accurate statement about themselves. And we'll take a look at another exercise that helps to do this. But after you've done this a bunch with your clients, you should be pretty effective at helping them restructure beliefs and statements that they can buy into and will really help them. One of the important things you need to keep in mind is the client has got to believe the new thought, the new belief, the new statement about themselves if it's going to help them. It doesn't matter what you think. It doesn't matter what you say. Your thoughts and your beliefs about them are not what cause their distress. What causes them their distress is what they think and believe. And you must help them come up with something they can buy into. If they don't believe it, at least 90%, if they don't believe it's at least 90% true, it will not help them. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But this is a good procedure, again, described by Burns in his book if you want to read more thoroughly about that. Let's go on to the next cognitive process that is a problem in anxiety, and that's worry. Anyone who's worked with people who have a problem with worry has seen this. Edward Hallowell, a psychiatrist, wrote a great book and has this statement on worry. He says, worry comes from a heightened sense of vulnerability in the presence of a diminished sense of power. In other words, you might say that a person feels highly vulnerable with very little power to do anything about that. And if you can narrow the gap by either reducing the vulnerability they feel and the risk involved in this, or increase their sense of power, or both, you can help them reduce worry. And I'll show you a chart that just depicts this a little bit in a minute. But the next bullet says, worry arises not from what is real, but from what is imagined, from the what if. People with anxiety are great about asking the question, what if this, and what if that? And it becomes very toxic. And part of what happens often to these people is it starts to run amok, and they spend so much time thinking about what if that they can't focus on anything else. Hallowell in his book, by the way, the book is entitled Worry, Controlling It and Using It Wisely. He says that worry is basically just a form of fear. It's the cognitive result of perfectionism. It arises from not what is real, but from what is imagined, and that it's kind of spreads out in different directions, that the more a person worries, the more problems they have in worrying, and it'll become a real problem for them. And he says it's important to stop worry in the initial moments of worry. This is a chart that I use to kind of depict worry for a client and help them understand worry. Again, it's the high sense of vulnerability, and over here is power. They have a very low sense of power. In other words, something bad is going to happen, and there's nothing I can do about it, and there's a big gap right here. Worry occurs and increases as the gap between vulnerability and power increases. The greater the gap, the more one worries. Again, to reduce worry, reduce the gap by increasing a sense of power, lowering the sense of vulnerability, or both. Let me just talk to you a little bit about how to do that. The tentacle of toxic worry can be severed during what's called the window of opportunity, and that's the first 60 seconds when a person starts to worry. If they allow their worry to go beyond that 60 seconds, then it's going to be harder and harder for them to stop their worry. So if you're going to help them, first you talk about reducing the sense of vulnerability, and you discuss some of the cognitive distortions and what they're thinking and saying. Maybe you've done a downward arrow exercise and you've got it to the bottom line of what they're worried about. Help them seek comfort, either that this bad thing is not really likely, or it is not really that terrible. And then the second thing you do is increase their sense of power. Find appropriate, believable solutions. Help them seek comfort that either I can tolerate this better than I think, or I can do something about it. And then the third thing they can do is seek counsel and reassurance from trusted people that they trust. One sister I worked with at the MTC came in. She was about to leave to the MTC and go to the field. We had worked. She had made a lot of good progress. And I said, so how do you feel about going to the field? And she said, I am really worried. And I said, what are you worried about? And her comment was, her response was, well, I'm afraid I'll get into a lesson and be teaching and I'll get lost and won't know where I am. And I said, right, you will. So what can you do about that? I mean, it's going to happen to you. It happens to just about everybody. So what are you going to do? And so we talked about it, and we talked about how she could sit down with her companion and discuss this fear and figure out some way for her to send a signal to her companion that she's lost and doesn't know what to do. Just something simple like saying, you know, I'd like to pause at this point in our lesson and ask Sister Jones if she has anything she'd like to add. And she's worked that out with her companion so that her companion knows that's the signal, I'm lost and I don't know what to do, so would you please take over? And so we talked about that. We talked about how she could have maybe in her book of scriptures the really brief outline of the lesson, and all she's got to do is turn to that page and look at it. So we're increasing her sense of power, or something she can do. As we narrow that gap, then she stops worrying quite so much. We talked about a few other things. We talked about how if you just have a scripture on baptism, you know you're talking about baptism, and you say, well, let's read a scripture on baptism, and then you just read it while you sit there and try to figure out or thumb through your notes or whatever and remember where you are. So we talked about 3 or 4 solutions, and she started to settle down and stop worrying. So that's what you do, is you help them find those kinds of things, narrow that gap, and then they don't worry quite so much. So teach people how to do this. It's very helpful to them. Let me go to another exercise that I really like. This is probably one of my favorite. It's called the Daily Mood Log. Again, this is one of David Burns' exercise out of his book, the Feeling Good Handbook. This is a 4-step process for teaching people how to change their thoughts in order to change their feelings. So let's just kind of read through this exercise together. I did this. This is an example of one that I did with a missionary. Actually, this is about a year old. I do this probably with most of the missionaries I work with. But the first step is to have them describe what happened when they got upset. Right up here at the top. In this particular case, this is a missionary who had had problems with OCD, had been through treatment, came to the MTC with that. In his district, there were 2 elders who went home because of OCD, and his thought was, I'm afraid I'm going to be sent home also. And so we talked about that briefly, and then we did step number 2. I went through this list, and it says, record your feelings about this situation and rate how intense they are between 1 to 100. So we go through the list, and he identified in the first group he felt sad and unhappy. And over here in the box where it says % before, that means before doing the exercise, how much did how strong was that feeling? It was about 30% out of 100. The next group out of that list, he identified anxious and frightened. And he said that's at about 50 on a scale of 0 to 100. We went through these others. He didn't feel any guilt or inferiority, but he felt some loneliness, about 15%. He felt some discouragement, about 25%. The next step, third step, is to write down your negative thoughts that are making you upset and record how strongly you believe each one from 0 to 100. So we did that first, and he said, okay, one of the thoughts I have is, I'm next. Now, he told me he believed that before doing the exercise, about 25%. My guess is he believed that much higher, or he wouldn't have been near as distressed by it. But he said it was 25%, so I accepted that. The next thought he identified was, maybe I'm not as prepared as I thought I was. And then a third thought he identified is, maybe I really want to go home and don't want to be a missionary, and maybe I'm just using this as an excuse. And he believed that at about 40%. The next step is to identify the distortions in each one of these thoughts. So we went through the list of distortions. And for that first thought, he identified that it was overgeneralization, jumping to conclusions, minimization and magnification, a should statement, labeling. He felt like he was labeling, and then self-blame. So he identified 6 distortions in that thought. The next thought, we went through the same list. He thought that was all or nothing thinking, overgeneralization, mental filter, jumping to conclusions, minimization, magnification, a should statement, and again, he thought he was labeling himself. And then the third thought, he identified jumping to conclusions, emotional reasoning, a should statement, and self-blame. Once I've done that and gone through and identified these distortions with the client, we'll talk about, and I'll ask them the question, what does that mean about these thoughts? And they'll say, well, they're distorted. It's not unusual, as I pointed out earlier, to have 10 distortions in one thought. Sometimes I will identify a distortion I see and ask them if it's there for them. It's important that they identify that, because they may not be thinking it in the same way you are. But it's not unusual for them to have 8 distortions in a thought. So once we've talked about that and they can see that, then we say, okay, now what we want to do is come up with a positive thought. And so what I asked him to do is I said, okay, tell me what you would say if this were a good friend of yours who had the same problem. What would you say? And he said, well, I'd say, you're okay to be here. And I asked him, okay, how much of you believes that's true? That you're okay to be here, you've already overcome this. He said, well, it's about 15% true. I said, okay, that's not good enough. We've got to strengthen this. What can you add to this? He said, okay, well, I could say, yeah, but I've learned how to work with this. These other elders who went home don't know how to work with it. So he could say that. I said, okay, how true is that? And he said, well, that's about 70%. And I said, well, that's better, but not quite good enough. We've got to strengthen it. What can we add? And finally, what we came up with is, I may be vulnerable, but I know how to work with this. He said, yeah, that feels right. And so he said he thought that was 90% true. I said, okay, now how true is it that you're next and you're going home? And he said, now that I've done this, I think that maybe is 10% true. So basically that's the procedure. You can do that with each of these thoughts. Sometimes the one thought addresses all 3 of the thoughts that are over on the left. You may have, by the way, 4 or 5 negative thoughts over here, and you have a lot to work with over on the right-hand side. One of the things that's important to keep in mind is, and this is on the back side of the form that I use, there's a list of the cognitive distortions, and we'll use that to help identify, but there's a troubleshooting guide at the bottom of that. The hardest part for the client is coming up with these positive thoughts right here. That is tough to do. If they could do this on their own, they wouldn't be thinking the negative stuff, and they wouldn't be talking to you as a client. They wouldn't need your help. They can't do this. They do this very easily. They cannot think the positive stuff. And so they're going to need a lot of help. This is a tough thing for them to do. You can't just say to them, start thinking positively. They don't know how to do that. So you've got to teach them how to do that. There are reasons that they may be having a problem. One is, maybe they haven't really correctly identified what is upsetting them. Another problem is maybe that they do not want to change their negative feelings about this situation. Frankly, I haven't seen that very often, but that's always a possibility. The third problem is that maybe they have not identified their automatic thoughts properly. Maybe they're just talking about events and not discussing what they're thinking. So you need to be sure that these negative thoughts are really thoughts that have gone through their head. The fourth one, and this is probably the key to why they may be having a problem. And let me just read this through. Are my rational responses convincing, valid statements that put the lie to my negative thoughts? Structuring positive, believable thoughts is the most challenging part of the exercise. If you believe the positive thought is below 90%, keep working on the thought. There is something wrong with it. Rationalizations won't make you feel better. Maybe you have swung too far away from what you believe in your negative thought. Positive thoughts must be realistic, believable, and contradict the automatic thoughts. The moment you see the lie in your negative thoughts, you will feel better. So coming up with those positive thoughts, they have to work with that. Let's talk about this just a little bit more. I'm next. He is a third of 3 missionaries who have OCD. 2 have gone home. It is possible that he would go home, so we can't ignore that. We can't very well in a positive thought say over here, oh, I'm not going home, I don't have any problems, because he does have a problem. He's having a problem with OCD, and it has flared up a little bit, and he's struggling a little bit at the MTC. So the possibility he would be next and go home is really true. What he has to do is come up with some way to say that. He can't very well deny that there is that possibility. So you can't ignore the truth. There may be some truth over here. Instead of saying, I'm next, you say, I may be vulnerable, but I know how to work with this. This statement incorporates that possibility that he could go home, that he's vulnerable. He accepts that. So he's accepting the truth that he's vulnerable, but he's reassuring himself that he's learned how to work with it and he knows what to do and he can apply his strategies. So don't throw the truth out. There may be some truth over here. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There may be some things over here that need to be addressed in the positive thought. So spend time helping them come up with a positive thought that is 90% believable and gives them comfort. If you want to know more about the Daily Mood Log, you can again go to Burns' book, The Feeling Good Handbook. If you get a chance to go to his 2-day seminar, that's what I would recommend. For, I think, I can't remember, $100 or $200, you can buy his binder with all the tools that he's got in it. They're all copyrighted, so you have to be a little careful about using those. Can't use them and sell them, but certainly we can use them if we're not. Let me move on to behavioral patterns. Avoidance exacerbates anxiety, and it's manifest in all different kinds of anxiety. There are avoidant behavioral patterns, and you've seen that in your clients. Exposure to the things that trigger their anxiety helps cure anxiety. So you need to learn to do the exposure response prevention. Many of you are familiar with that concept and that principle. The goal is the triggers for anxiety will become boring and meaningless to them instead of anxiety provoking. The more they avoid the exposure to things that trigger their anxiety, the longer it will be before they will recover. A good rule of thumb that you need to teach them is, with regard to avoidance and exposure, that they must do the opposite of what their anxiety is telling them to do. If their anxiety is telling them to avoid crowds, they need to go spend time in crowds. If their anxiety is telling them to stay away from high places, they need to go someplace that's high and stay there until it becomes boring to them. You're all familiar with the flooding process with phobias, the desensitization process. This is the same principle, and it's important to teach clients this process, that they understand that and know how that plays out in their anxiety. I teach my clients that if you're feeling compelled to do something, don't. If you're feeling like you should avoid something, don't avoid it. So those things that they feel like they have to do because of their anxiety, they avoid. The things they feel like they shouldn't do, they go do. And if you can teach them to do that and get them to start acting on that, that'll help them a lot. Let's go to the last trait of the underlying causes, hidden emotion. This is a Freudian concept. It's David Burns is the only one I know of who talks about this. Basically, he says that anxious individuals have simple things that bother them that they are not dealing with, like being mad at someone or not liking their job. Instead of dealing with these problems and expressing their feelings, anxious people sweep them under the carpet and then develop some sort of fear or phobia instead. And then he says, once you discover this problem and deal with it, their anxiety often improves. Sometimes the symptoms disappear entirely. Let me just share a few other concepts on hidden emotion here. Hidden emotion, this model, is a way of peeking under the carpet, so to speak, to find the cause for their anxiety. It is compounded by personality traits like niceness, we've talked about. Niceness is the cause of all anxiety. The belief is nice people do not express anxiety, frustration, irritation, displeasure. They just keep their feelings to themselves and stuff it. Anxious people are people pleasers, and I can't do anything to displease people. And then the perfectionism. Hidden emotions. Here's some questions that will help you identify hidden emotions. And David Burns recommends asking this question at the beginning of every interview. Are you focusing on your anxiety to avoid dealing with something upsetting? What is the real problem that's bothering you? Do you secretly resent someone, your job? Are you unhappy about something? How do you really feel? The therapist asks these questions, and eventually the client may be able to identify what's going on. Burns says he's never been able to figure it out on his own, that it's always the client who has to tell him. That he'll guess, but he's usually wrong. Some techniques that will help identify that, we've already talked about. The downward arrow technique may give you some hints. Interpersonal downward arrow or the what-if technique. Let me just give you a couple examples of what we're talking about here with the hidden emotion. The one that he gave that I remember is a client of his who got married, and shortly after getting married, she went to work and had a panic attack at work. She got sick. She started throwing up. She had to go home. The next day she went to work, same thing happened to her. And so she went to him to get some help with this. And as he talked with her, he learned some things through some of these exercises. And what he learned was that she hated her job. She had been on this job for a long time. I'm not sure, a number of years, more than 10 years. She was office staff. Her boss is somebody that she dearly cared about. It was a small family business. She felt like her work was keeping the business afloat, that she had to stay on the job constantly. She had never taken a day of sick leave or a day of vacation, and the whole time she had worked for this fellow. But she just couldn't stand it. She wanted to quit, but was afraid to, because she was afraid of hurting him and afraid that his business would go under. When she got married, she then thought that she had to stay in this job because now that they were married, she and her husband, they depended on her income to pay their bills, and so she now had to have this job, and there was no way she could get out. And so she started having these panic attacks at work. When they finally identified that she really didn't like her job, David Burns had her go home and talk to her husband, which she did. And he said, you know, it's okay if you quit. And so she went to work and talked to her boss. And he said, you know, we would really miss you, but as long as you'll give us notice, we can find someone else. And as soon as she'd had those conversations, her panic attacks at work stopped. Eventually, she did quit. She went home. In working with this, let me just tell you about one missionary I worked with a couple of years ago, struggling with OCD, assigned to go to a foreign country, speaking a very complicated, difficult language, basically doing reasonably well, but having a problem with intrusive thoughts. And most of his intrusive thoughts that were pestering him were thoughts about hurting people. He would have horrific and graphic images about things he could do to people that came into his mind, which was really disturbing and distressing to him. On the compulsive side, when he would go into a room, he would have to balance everything in the room. He'd pair everything up in pairs, and he could not focus on what was going on in the room until he had everything paired up in the room. And as soon as he had everything balanced, then he could pay attention to other things. As we talked about, and when we did the downward arrow exercise, one of the things that I learned about him was that he was the youngest of 4 children. He had 3 older sisters who, his mother had always wanted to have a boy. And when he finally came along, she was so delighted and pleased. She certainly loved her daughters, but she was just thrilled to have a son finally. And as she raised these children, she always indulged him, gave him everything he wanted, never disciplined him, never corrected him. Whatever he wanted was fine and okay. She did discipline the daughters, did restrict them, restrict their privileges, punish them when they needed it. But he never got any punishment. He always could get everything he wanted. As a matter of fact, his comment was, if my dad wanted to go fishing, my mom would be mad. But if I wanted to go fishing with my dad, it was always okay. Well, when he reached teenage years, he noticed this, and he really felt distressed by it. And it bothered him that there was this double standard in the family. And he started getting mad and kind of mad at his mom over this. But he's such a nice kid, he couldn't say anything to her. So he started to rebel. He started to do things to try to make her mad so she'd yell at him or punish him. And she'd never do it. She'd never give in. Finally, I think he gave up. He came on his mission. We talked about this. And I said, you know what? You need to talk to your mom about this. You need to share with her some of the feelings you've had and kind of resolve this. You can do this in one of 2 ways. You can either write a letter to her, or we can arrange for you to have a phone conversation. What he chose to do was he decided he'd write a letter to her. And he wrote the letter, and he sent the letter to his mother. And as I worked with him, things really settled down for him in regard to OCD. It dropped off considerably. His OCD dropped off considerably. What Burns says is that if you don't address the hidden emotion, you're only dealing with 50% of the problem. That they will only get relief from 50% of the problem. I'm not sure if that's entirely true. That's his experience. I would say that when I have been able to find the hidden emotion with missionaries and help them with it, they do much better. The sister I mentioned earlier, whose parents expected perfection of her, we talked about her working this out with her parents. That was a scary prospect for her, and she realizes she needs to do that. She did not do that while at the MTC, but we talked about the importance of doing that and getting some relief. I would suggest you work with this, work with the hidden emotion. If you have questions about it, feel free to call me at the MTC. I'd be happy to discuss it with you more in detail. There's not a lot of literature on this. David Burns doesn't really have much in his book on hidden emotion. Most of what I've learned I gained from the training, my notes, the training document he gave us, and my own experience with it. But I would challenge you to see if you can help the client identify that hidden emotion and then help them with that issue. Well, it's been good to talk to you today. My voice is a little dry. Hopefully this presentation hasn't been as dry. Let me just close by summarizing a couple of basic important concepts for you. And this is based on my experience in treating anxiety. First point is that it's important to teach your clients to manage these personality traits that they have, the niceness, the perfectionism. How much of that do they have? How often does it get in the way? Do exercises with them that will help them with that. Second concept, help them change the cognitive patterns. Learn how to put the lie to their thoughts. They've got to have strategies for doing that. They won't do that automatically. They're going to need your help with that. Third thing, you have to help them identify the behavioral patterns that sustain their anxiety, the avoidance, the triggers that they avoid, the other things that they do in avoidance of their anxiety, the things they try to do to fix things and to manage things so that they won't lose control of their emotions. They've got to learn how to manage that and change those patterns and do just the opposite of what their anxiety tells them to do. And then also identify the hidden emotion and address that. A few other ideas I'd like to share with you. It is imperative in treating clients with anxiety that they do the homework. You have got to give them things to do. Talk therapy by itself will not help them improve. Initially, Burns recommends, and I agree with this, you need to contract with them at the beginning of therapy that they will do the homework you're going to give them. You need to talk to them about that you can help them, but they're going to have to do some things in between sessions. And get them to agree with that. Burns recommends getting that in writing from them because there are going to be times when they don't do the homework. And if they do not do the homework, they will not improve. They will only improve by doing the homework and learning how to change these personality, cognitive, behavioral, and emotional factors that contribute to their anxiety. So it is critical. Homework is critical. Matter of fact, Burns says that he will not work with people who will not do homework. He sends them to somebody else. He says, if you're wanting to do talk therapy, let me refer you because I don't do that. And so that's how strongly he feels about it. I would agree. I think it's imperative that if you're going to work with people with anxiety, that you have homework assignments for them and that they do them. The second point is you need to be sure to prepare them for a return of symptoms when they are distressed. It's normal and to be expected. There's something about stress and their anxiety symptoms. When they get distressed about something that's not related to the anxiety, their anxiety symptoms will flare up. That's true, for example, with OCD. And I'll talk to missionaries about how when they go to the field, if they're having a problem with their companion and they're not getting along, then their OCD will flare up. So they have to learn to take care of the problems with their companion, then their OCD will settle down. But stress will trigger the symptoms. It's kind of that diathesis stress model. So help them learn to work with stress. You can't eliminate stress from their lives. They can't, and you can't, but you can teach them how to work with that so that their symptoms settle down. So it's imperative to prepare them for that so that they don't say, when their symptoms come back, woe is me. Every missionary who I work with who struggles with OCD, as they prepare to leave to go to the field, they're a little nervous, so their OCD flares up a little. When they get to the field, it will flare up. But they've learned some strategies, they can get through that and they can manage it and settle down. And once they get a little more comfortable and work with things with their stress in the field, they'll be fine. And so you teach them how to do that. One other thing I just want to add in closing is be sure you have a very specific treatment plan. Let me just show you the model that David Burns uses. He draws a circle, and then around the circle, he will list the different exercises he's going to do with the client. He'll do maybe the downward arrow. He'll focus on hidden emotion. He'll do the cost-benefit analysis with them. He'll do daily mood log and have them go home and do that on a daily basis and practice that, changing their thoughts. If they will do that, they can get to the point where they can do that in their head and do that within 30 to 60 seconds and change their feelings. He'll do one he calls examine the evidence. He'll identify distortions and teach them about that. He'll revise maybe their belief script, their beliefs that they have. He'll do response prevention. He'll do a survey method and then acceptance paradox. And if they still have anxiety, then he goes on to another list. Basically, his recommendation is fail as fast as you can while you're in treatment. Do as many exercises as quickly as you can until you get to the ones that will really help your clients feel much better. His book, there's at least 50 exercises in here that he uses. I've talked to you about a few of them. There are others that you can read about and learn about and apply. You probably have some effective ones that you'd want to throw onto this list. But just use a whole variety of things and tools to work with anxiety. That's about all I really have to say. I've enjoyed having this opportunity to present this information. It's really solidified, at least for me in my mind, many of the concepts around treatment of anxiety. I hope it's as helpful to you. Like any other training, this training will only be helpful to you if you learn how to augment what you're already doing and focus on the things that will be helpful for clients. Just listening to this training isn't going to really improve your treatment with people. You've got to get in, read the literature, practice these things with people, try them out, find the things that you really like, things that work, and add tools to your arsenal, and then do these exercises with your clients. It's a fun way to work with people. I'd rather work with anxiety, frankly, than anything else at this point. You know, there's a saying that kind of applies to anxiety and depression. Depression's a little more difficult to work with. You do a lot of the same things with depression. But the saying is that it's easier to tame a fanatic than to put life into a corpse. Maybe that's why I like working with anxiety. It's easier to settle anxiety down than it is to elevate somebody's mood to work with them. At least it is for me. And this is a fun way to do that. I hope this information is helpful to you. I sure wish you well. If you have questions, if you want to talk, feel free to call me anytime. I'd be happy to help you answer any questions you might have. And I sure wish you the best. Good luck.